11 days ago, the global economy lost one of its most important assumptions. And when that assumption disappeared, the math stopped working. Not the stock market math, not the oil traders' calculations. The deeper equation that governments, banks, and investors rely on to understand the world. For decades, that equation worked perfectly, until a war changed one critical variable. And once that variable changed, the entire system started producing different answers. Let me show you exactly how. Because the first number you need to understand is something most people have never heard, yet it quietly powers the modern world. 20 million. That's how many barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. 20 million barrels. Roughly one-fifth of all the oil consumed on Earth flows through a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. For decades, that channel has been the beating heart of the global energy system. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates pass through it on their way to Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The system works because everyone assumes the strait will remain open. But war changes assumptions. When tensions between Iran and Israel escalated, energy traders began asking a simple question. What happens if that channel closes? Suddenly, the global oil equation begins to break. Because there is no easy replacement for 20 million barrels of oil per day. You cannot simply switch on another pipeline. You cannot ask another country to instantly produce that much extra supply. Energy systems are built over decades. They cannot be rebuilt overnight. And when supply becomes uncertain, the price of energy moves first. Oil surged rapidly as traders began pricing in the risk. Markets do not wait for confirmation. They react to probability. But oil prices are only the first layer of the story. Because oil is not just another commodity. Energy is the foundation of the global economy. Every product, every shipment, every factory depends on it. When energy prices rise, the cost of almost everything rises with it. And that's where the second number appears. The number that affects ordinary families far more directly than global energy markets. In the United States, the average household spends roughly $2,500 per year on fuel. For many families, that works out to around $50 each week just to fill the car. That number may not sound dramatic until energy prices rise. When oil prices climb toward $100 per barrel, fuel prices follow. Suddenly, that $50 weekly cost becomes $60 or $70. Over the course of a year, that difference quietly removes hundreds of dollars from household budgets. Money that would have gone to groceries. Money that would have covered a medical bill. Money that might have been saved. Economists sometimes call this the invisible tax. It doesn't appear as legislation. No government debates it. But it shows up every time a family pulls into a petrol station or gas pump. And when millions of families spend more on fuel, something else in the economy receives less. Restaurants see fewer customers. Retail sales slow. Small businesses feel the pressure first. The ripple moves quietly through local economies. But energy costs do not stop with households. They move across borders, because the global economy depends on supply chains that stretch thousands of miles. And that brings us to the third layer of the story. Asia. About 80% of the oil that moves through the Strait of Hormuz is destined for Asian economies. China, India, Japan, South Korea. These countries rely heavily on imported energy to power their industries. Factories need electricity. Shipping ports need fuel. Manufacturing lines depend on stable energy supplies. If oil prices surge, production costs rise. And when production costs rise, global supply chains begin to tighten. Products become more expensive to make. Shipping becomes more expensive. Prices rise in places far removed from the original crisis. A war in the Middle East begins affecting factories in Asia. Those factories supply stores in Europe and North America. Suddenly, inflation pressures begin to return, not because governments changed policy, not because consumers changed behavior, but because the energy math changed. and the energy math affects everything connected to it. But there is another number hidden inside this crisis, a number almost nobody was discussing until recently: helium. Most people think of helium as the gas inside party balloons. But in global economics, helium plays a very different role. It is a critical industrial material used in the production of semiconductors. Semiconductors power smartphones, computers, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence data centers. Modern technology depends on a steady supply of these tiny electronic components, and semiconductor production requires helium. Qatar produces a large share of the world's helium supply. When production facilities there shut down during regional instability, the global supply chain feels the shock. Not immediately, but gradually. Supply shortages in advanced manufacturing rarely appear overnight. They build quietly. Weeks pass, then months. Eventually, factories begin slowing production. Technology companies begin warning about supply constraints, and suddenly the crisis that started with oil spreads into another industry entirely. This is how modern economic disruptions work. They arrive in layers. The first layer is obvious. Energy prices spike, stock markets react, currencies move. The second layer arrives later. Manufacturing slows, shipping costs rise. Inflation pressures return. The third layer takes the longest to appear. Hidden bottlenecks, rare materials, specialized supply chains, the kinds of dependencies most people never notice until they break. By the time the third layer becomes obvious, experienced investors have already been studying the consequences for months. Because successful investors do not focus on headlines. They trace the chain of cause and effect. They ask a different question, not what happened today, but what happens next. How long does the disruption last? Which industries are most exposed? Which companies depend on the affected supply chains? Every crisis produces both risk and opportunity. The difference between the two often depends on preparation. Investors who panic during uncertainty tend to react emotionally. They sell assets at the worst possible moment. They chase headlines. They respond to fear. Investors who prepare in advance behave differently. They observe the variables that actually matter. In this case, the most important variable is simple: energy supply. If shipping routes reopen quickly and oil prices stabilize, the global economy absorbs the shock. Growth slows slightly. Inflation ticks upward, but the system continues functioning. If disruption continues for months, the consequences deepen. Energy costs remain elevated. Manufacturing slows. Inflation spreads through multiple industries. Markets begin adjusting expectations for economic growth. The difference between those two outcomes depends on a small number of variables. Variables that most people rarely consider, but understanding them changes how you interpret the news. Because global economic systems often appear stable, until a single assumption stops holding. For decades, the world assumed that critical shipping routes would remain open, that energy supply would remain reliable, that supply chains would continue flowing without interruption. When those assumptions hold, the math works. Growth continues. Trade expands. Prices remain relatively stable. But when one assumption breaks, the equation changes. That is the deeper lesson of the current oil crisis. The global economy is not fragile because of a single event. It is fragile because it depends on interconnected systems that few people fully understand. Energy, shipping, manufacturing, technology. Each system supports the others. When one begins to fail, the others begin to adjust, and those adjustments ripple across the entire world. For investors, businesses, and ordinary families, the lesson is the same. Understanding the system matters more than reacting to headlines. Because once you understand the variables that drive the system, you begin to see economic events differently. What looks like chaos often follows a clear chain of consequences, and the people who understand that chain are rarely the ones surprised by what happens next. The math of the global economy has not disappeared, but it has changed. And when the numbers change, the world eventually changes with them. The question is not whether the equation will adjust. The question is how quickly the rest of us notice that it already has.